Prise du débat, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's always an honour to be able to stand in this place and debate the issues that are so important to my constituents and Canadians. You know, it's interesting, though, how as we enter into debate on this subject, I have heard today and over the course of the last number of months an emphasis of a massive disconnect that exists. I've heard it in the previous members' speeches. I've been hearing it in questions and comments. I heard it at committee, and I did have the chance, although I'm not a regular member of the Public Safety Committee. I was in the previous Parliament, but not in this Parliament. I did have a chance to participate in some of those meetings. We are seeing a massive disconnect between rural and urban Canada. Now, there are many Liberals that would try to diminish that and use fanciful language to suggest that they somehow are listening to those voices and whatnot. But, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you very, very clearly that when I have canvassed and spoken with so many of my constituents, that they feel that they have been abandoned entirely by this Liberal government and their political and ideological agenda that is unfairly targeting them. So, Mr. Speaker, we're debating Bill C-21. Now, many Canadians have followed this debate very closely, and it's interesting because it has evolved. This debate has evolved quite substantially. And I'm going to take you back, Mr. Speaker, if I could, to 2015. Where at the time you had the then leader of the Liberal Party, the now Prime Minister, who made it very, very clear that he, quite frankly, thought that the situation with firearms in Canada was at a good place. He promised to not bring back a gun registry. He said that, in fact, I don't have the quote in front of me, Mr. Speaker, but he's quoted by saying that his protection detail used to let him play with their service revolvers and had a great deal of respect for those firearms owners. But, Mr. Speaker, it seems like as years have gone by, scandals have erupted. There's been a gradual diminishment of Liberal support from across the country. The Liberals seem to fall back on an old tactic. That is, when they're failing, they go back to attacking those who they think they can score political points. But, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you today that with the introduction and the amendments that were initially proposed, and now as the Liberals have rammed through this legislation that is supposed to be about firearms, and it's messaged in the guise of public safety. But it really is just an attack from a government that is floundering and needing to change the channel from their scandals, mismanagement, and where the country is at, because so many Canadians are suffering. So instead of dealing with the real issues that Canadians are suffering from, they are saying, well, look over here, let's simply go to something that we think we can score political points on. And, Mr. Speaker, that is cheap politics. And it increasingly furthers that divide that I mentioned, that rural-urban divide. But it also is, when you play those sorts of games, it doesn't actually create good public policy. And we have seen that so directly here. And what's ironic, Mr. Speaker, is that while we have a very large bill with a significant level of complexity, far more than I'd be able to fit in a 10-minute speech, we see that the Liberals, while talking about this being about Canadian safety, taking guns off the streets, they fail, absolutely fail, to acknowledge that the problem is not law-abiding firearms owners. The problem is not those who go through training and keep up their certification and their licensing and are legally allowed to own firearms in this country. Those individuals, the more than 2 million firearms owners, many of which I'm proud to represent, coming from a rural area, of which there's hunters and sport shooters and farmers. In fact, many farmers and ranchers, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not sure that the Liberals quite understand this, but a firearm is a tool. It is a tool like any other, and it's important to acknowledge that. Yet you have them attacking these individuals with this gun confiscation regime, and they're saying that it's about public safety, when the reality is it does nothing. In fact, when I asked at committee whether or not some of the policies that had been brought in at a provincial level had resulted in any reductions in crimes, they couldn't answer those questions, Mr. Speaker. So I think that it is ironic and unfortunate that you see the politicization of this issue and 2.1 million Canadians that are being targeted for the cheap political points of a Prime Minister that is bogged down by scandal, corruption, and mismanagement, and when Canadians can hardly afford to put food on their table. So what do the Liberals do? Well, they go back to talking about guns. But I want to talk about specifically the public safety issue because, Mr. Speaker, that is a huge issue. We've seen a massive increase in violent crime. We have seen a massive increase in the illegal use of firearms. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we see how instead of the Liberals addressing the real root of the problem, smuggled guns, violent criminal behavior, a broken bail system, Mr. Speaker, we see that instead of doing the hard work that is required to deal with that, well, let's just go after the easy target, law-abiding firearms owners. And, Mr. Speaker, the unfortunate reality is that there are Canadians that are dying as a result of the violent crime. There are Canadians that there are victims, and it is because of a soft-on-crime agenda that they refuse to acknowledge as part of the problem. And, Mr. Speaker, my constituents are sick and tired of it. They see how damaging the soft-on-crime agenda is to the public safety of our entire country, rural, urban, and everywhere in between. But instead of doing anything about it, the Liberals say, well, it's those who are trained, vetted, and every single day have a check ran against them in the police system to ensure that they continue to be allowed to own those firearms. And, Mr. Speaker, the facts are that law-abiding firearms owners are some of the least likely individuals in this country to be able to commit a crime. And members from the Liberal Party talk about not wanting to import American-style politics into the debate. Well, Mr. Speaker, it is that party that is playing those sorts of divisive games and trying to throw 2.1 million Canadians under the bus so they can score a few points. And, Mr. Speaker, further to that point, it was not Conservatives who had a former presidential candidate come and speak at their party convention. It was those Liberals. And I would simply ask the question that as they're spouting off rhetoric about firearms, do they agree with Hillary Clinton's position on the Second Amendment? Because she's pretty pro-gun compared to some of the things that they're saying. So, Mr. Speaker, the hypocrisy is rich. And the consequence is that their dividing for political gain is putting many of my constituents in an untenable position. Because I have many constituents that are proud of that rural heritage, that sporting heritage, that conservation heritage. And I don't have time to get into the conservation aspect of hunting, how important that is for wildlife management across this country. But, Mr. Speaker, we see how the Liberals are throwing that all away. And I would just note, and I made this point in committee yesterday, you see a virtual ban on handguns. You see so many firearms, including hunting rifles, that will be confiscated. You see that they've devastated many small business owners across the country, those who would own gun shops and sporting goods stores. So, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are pretty quick to accuse regular law-abiding Canadians of all the worst possible things. Yet, even in this bill, you have a carve-out for federal police forces. For example, the ability for the Nuclear Commission of Canada to allow their peace officers to carry firearms. So you have, and all of us in this place appreciate very much the good work that our security personnel do around here. Well, Mr. Speaker, they carry guns, and that's okay. We have police forces, the RCMP and municipal police forces, provincial police forces, that they all carry guns, and that's okay. Yet those Liberals are saying that they want the protection, but they don't trust Canadians. That's what they're saying. And as I come down to the last minute of my speech, Mr. Speaker, we have here a massive disconnect between the way that one would actually solve concerns related to public safety versus how the Liberals are simply taking an easy path and playing cheap politics and targeting so many of my constituents. So, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest this. There's a clear difference in the way that we would approach issues of public safety in this country. You have a political party that will go after those who don't commit the crimes and let those who do back out on the streets with a weak bail system and parole system that is literally seeing people killed. And that's not an exaggeration, Mr. Speaker. Whereas, what's the Conservative plan? We hear often from the Liberals that Conservatives, they want to hear the Conservative plan. So let me give you a little bit of what that looks like. We'll stop going after those who are least likely to commit the crimes, and we will put the violent repeat offenders behind bars where they belong and ensure that a true balance is met so that Canadians can trust the fact that they are not being targeted simply because they go through the process and are trusted to own a firearm versus those who are not.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Milton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Cheap politics, petty games, and filibuster. Indeed, my colleague opposite, talked about some of the petty games, but he didn't reference the fact that so much of the time that they've been asking for has been wasted by the Conservatives through this filibuster process. Mr. Speaker, the gun lobby is simultaneously attacking members of Parliament like me on social media for standing up for public safety and responsible gun laws, and retweeting Conservative MPs and the leader of the Conservative Party. So it seems to me now that, similar to the United States, the Canadian gun lobby and the Conservative Party in Canada are one and the same. They're clearly bed buddies, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is very, very quick to the Speaker. And my colleague said that we're all urban MPs on this side. Mr. Speaker, I'm not. I'm a semi-rural MP. I have lots of avid hunters and farmers in my community as well. Two questions really quickly, Mr. Speaker. Do Canadians need AR-15s to protect their farms? Do they use them for hunting? Do they use assault-style weapons and weapons of war for these sports, as he put it? Secondly, has the member opposite ever benefited from fundraising? Has he ever keynoted a gala for the Canadian gun lobby, as many of his colleagues have?
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Well, Mr. Speaker, certainly that member would be welcome to come and visit some of the rural communities that are absolutely furious and frustrated with how they are so quick to attack those that choose to follow the law versus those who don't. You want to talk about American-style politics, Mr. Speaker, who headlined their convention? A supporter of the Second Amendment, Hillary Clinton. So the hypocrisy is rich coming from that party, and specifically that member. You know, it's interesting in his pre-political life. You know, he was pretty quick to brag about, you know, his history in the Olympics. Yet what this bill actually does, and common sense amendment.
I believe we have a point of order from the honourable member for Milton.
Yeah, this, like, every time that member gets up, he accuses me of bragging about something. I don't have to brag about going to the Olympics. I represented Canada 4 times. That's not bragging. That's a fact, Mr. Speaker. I'm not bragging.
It's not a point of order. We are getting into debate. The honourable parliamentary secretary.
On the same point of order, I certainly would brag about him going to the Olympics. I wish I could accomplish such a feat, but
again, we're descending. We are descending with, you know, pretty deep into debate here. The honourable member for Milton.
I'm proud to stand up in this House to make sure that the rights of responsible gun owners, as well as those that aspire to compete in the Olympics, are upheld as the legislation does. Thank you, Mr.
Again, into debate. I think the honourable member had a few seconds to finish up the answer. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
When a common sense amendment was brought forward to expand the exemptions to ensure that various associations related with sports shooting, including those that went to the Olympics, the Liberals voted against it. Mr. Speaker, in fact, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Public Safety said that they want to ban handguns. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a little bit rich coming from the elitist type attitude from the members opposite that would target law-abiding Canadians, yet you see criminals walking free on our streets. Canadians can judge for themselves.
Questions and comments. Honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Battle River Crowfoot for his speech and for the passion that he has on this issue. In his speech, he talked about training, and I think there's something interesting in that. Of course, we've talked a bit about the amendments, and thank you to my colleague for her leadership on that. There were amendments to have hunting rifles removed from the list. But maybe we could talk more about the role of a shooting range in a community. Are permits too easy to get? I myself got a permit, and I've never shot a gun in my life. But you know, I think hunting can also be an important recreational activity. So I guess I'd like to know, who is this bill targeting, and what can we do about that? The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's interesting because there's unique constitutional exemptions, actually, that place some of the roles of the chief firearms officers directly into the hands of provinces. So I'm sure the member from the Bloc Québécois would especially with his attitude towards Quebec and provincial autonomy and whatnot, that would be they'd be very much on side with ensuring that the Liberals would respect provincial jurisdiction, of which, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty evident that they do not. But I do applaud him, because he, unlike so many in this House, took the time to get a position, what I'm assuming is a possession and an acquisition license, which would go through a process, a course to learn how to use a firearm, the respect that is required. You see, Mr. Speaker, those of us in this House that are making rules and regulations and laws surrounding so many different issues, we all take an effort to try and engage on the subject matter. We may not be able to become experts, but Mr. Speaker, we should do our best to learn and engage with the subject matter. And I applaud any member of this place that would take the time to get their PAL so that they can actually understand the rules and regulations as they are now. And I think that if there were those that would go through that process, they would learn that maybe we have a pretty good system that is designed to keep Canadians safe. And while they target those individuals that follow the law, they're letting criminals out on our streets, and people are dying as a result.
Hear, hear.